The turn of the 20th century brought many great things to America, including imperialism, electricity, the telephone, Major League Baseball, all kinds of great things that are going on. It also gives us new patterns of immigration. But rather than immigration and people coming from outside of our country into our country, we're starting to see this mass movement of people called migration. We start to see whites who were typically living in the cities such as New York, Boston, Philadelphia, starting to move out into the western places like Iowa, Ohio, Indiana, Nebraska, California, even. And immigrants starting to take over certain parts that were once controlled by low income whites. Now, for the African American in the South, the Jim Crow African American, life hadn't changed much since the end of slavery in 1865. And so many of them were seeking new employment. They were seeking a new way of life. They were seeking better opportunities, and those lied in the cities to the north. And so when we talk about the Great Migration, we think about this mass movement of not only people, but an entire race, culture, different sorts of social norms moving from the South, especially places like Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, the Carolinas, and moving up into northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, Des Moines, Waterloo, those type places. And so what exactly was the Great Migration? Well, the Great Migration was something that happened between the turn of the 20th century and the beginning of World War One. We saw large numbers of African Americans from the South move to the North for manufacturing jobs, agricultural jobs, and as railroad strike breakers. Large numbers of them came to Iowa, especially Waterloo, Davenport, Dubuque, Des Moines, as actual scabs or strike breakers for the Illinois Central Railroad, who had had a lot of their white workers go on strike. And so what that caused was this big gap in the labor market. And railroads are what ran America at that time. They were the bloodline of America. They moved passengers, they moved freight, they moved all kinds of things. And Iowa and the rest of the Midwest couldn't deal without those railroads. And so instead of fighting with labor unions and fighting with the whites that were in power, they chose to employ African Americans for several reasons. But most importantly, they could pay them less and they weren't allowed to unionize, which allowed the train companies, the railroad companies, to do whatever they wanted with these employees in terms of hours, living conditions, those kind of things. So, where did people come from? The Great Migration is something that not only, as I mentioned before, brought people, it brought cultural norms, ideas, songs, music, all kinds of things from the South and brought them to the North. Things that we hadn't seen much of in the northern cities. So, northern cities at this point are full of immigrants. They're full of Irish. They're full of Jews. They're full of people from Germany and Italy and Eastern Europe. They're full of whites who are working manufacturing jobs. They're full of old order immigrants who came from places like Ireland and Scotland and England. So we hadn't seen a lot of African Americans in the North, especially in those larger cities. And so what happens is we see this mass influx. So we talk a lot about immigration today, right? Talking about Mexicans coming into our country to work. The same thing is going on in Mexico as was going on in the United States this time. Large numbers of migrant farm workers are coming from southern Mexico to northern Mexico. Same sort of thing we're seeing during the Great Migration between 1910 and 1917. And large numbers of people come from the fields, the cotton fields, the growing, cotton and peanuts and those kind of things. And they're coming from those mag states, so Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, especially living along the Gulf Coast. So many of these men and women who are coming have a lot of expertise in agriculture. They have expertise in fishing. They have expertise in backwoodsmanship, the idea of creating things from nothing, since most of them were very poor. White recruiters actually came to the South, very similar to what carpetbaggers did back in the 1870s, came to the South and recruited these African American men and women to come north and to take the jobs of these white labor union people, especially on the railroads and manufacturing, because it made it easier for them, right? They could pay them less. As I said before, they weren't allowed to unionize. It was illegal. And so what it did was it created animosity amongst not only the white railroad workers or factory workers or industrial workers, but amongst the people living in those towns and those cities. And so people had to get there somehow, right? And it's pretty ironic that a lot of them took the train to get to where they were going. And a lot of those cities that are impacted by this movement, like I've said before, Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Louis, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Waterloo, Des Moines, those sort of places. And the other part of it is some of them even walked hundreds of miles to escape the Jim Crow South, to come north. And what they find in the North really isn't what they thought they were going to come to. And so a lot of times the availability of the way they could travel affected where they went. So if they were coming from northern Mississippi and they were walking, odds are they ended up in a place like Indianapolis or Chicago. If they had the money to ride the train and they were coming from Georgia, they may end up in a city like Chicago or Minneapolis. It just depended on how they were getting there and how much money they had. So why were they coming? You might say, why would you leave that life you've known for hundreds of years in the South to come north? And excuse me, the biggest reason is that the industrial growth in the northern cities were drawing workers in, workers of every nationality, color, race, ethnicity, because they were producing for the war effort. And when we say war effort, we don't mean America's war effort. We talk about the buildup of war in Europe. And so a lot of these people, as I mentioned before, are trying to escape the Jim Crow South. But what they find in northern cities are similar racial issues. They're not finding things that are laws prohibiting these things like they found in southern states. But what they are finding is that there's a lot of animosity, there's a lot of racism. We're not seeing the Ku Klux Klan, right? We're not seeing separate but equal. What we are seeing, though, is African Americans not being allowed to rent in certain parts of town or purchase something in a part of town. And so what we start to see is that these people are going to start settling in patterns, and they're going to start settling in certain parts of cities that have been vacated by the whites. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But the biggest enticement was the chance to make money and to have somewhat the American dream, right? They saw these whites following the Civil War living in poverty in the South, but saw them flourishing in the North. And 50 years after the Civil War, that's no different. The Southern farmer is still very poor. The Northern industrial worker seems like they have a pretty good life. And so the people living in the South, the African Americans in the South, decided to leave their traditional homes and come north. And the reason for that, as we said, was money was a big draw, but freedom. The idea of having no one tell you what to do, no one say that there was a law that said you had to drink out of a separate fountain. Those kind of things were very important to people coming to the North. So what did they find here? And I talked about this a couple of different times, but animosity is one thing. So as I mentioned before, animosity towards the movement of African Americans from the South shows up in cities. And it mainly shows up amongst the lowest of the low classes of whites. And the reason for that was, as we've mentioned before, people are always looking for those that are worse off than them. And so for a long time it was the immigrant. Now the immigrant was looking for someone else to kind of scapegoat or push their hatred or their feelings of how they were treated onto someone else. And African Americans happen to be those. This included segregated housing. And that segregated housing wasn't segregated by law. It was segregated by unwritten rule. Like, we're not going to rent to those type of people. The other side of the tracks is where you should live. And so what we get are these large concentrations of African Americans, and in some cases, multi-generational families, living near industrial centers and railway centers. And so when you think about populations, large African American, low socioeconomic status African Americans in the world today, we think about places like East St. Louis, the south side of Chicago, St. Paul, the east side of Waterloo, 8 Mile region of Detroit. And those people are traditional settlement of poor African Americans that came during the Great Migration that have been there cyclically or generationally. And so what this leads to is white flight and racism and just blatant racism. In the 1920s, the state that has the highest Ku Klux Klan membership per capita is Indiana. Nobody would have thought that. But with the northern movement of African Americans, racism comes with that. There's unregulated settlements, like I talked about, poor racial-based neighborhoods. But they use that to their advantage, African Americans, and they bring all kinds of great things, including music, poetry, and their way of life. And so through that, they bring things like jazz music, which comes from the Delta of Louisiana. They bring stories, traditional stories that were passed on by slaves via word of mouth. They bring slave chants with them. They bring all this cultural food. A lot of us like ribs, and a lot of us like Creole food. You like grits. Those all came with African Americans coming from the South. And so what it does is it creates this mixed culture in places. And so if you've ever traveled to Harlem, or you've ever been to Detroit or the south side of Chicago, you can still see the remnants of this. You can still see that impact that African American culture had on the South. It created things like jazz music, poetry slams, It brought African Americans together. It brought the barbershop mentality of the 1950s and 60s, all those kind of things. So we start to see cities developing racial and ethnic neighborhoods. So, for example, in Chicago, on the south side, you have Chinatown, you have Little Italy, and you have the south side, which is largely African American. You go to New York City. In Manhattan, you have Little Italy and Chinatown. But if you go out to the suburbs, you have suburbs like Harlem that are highly African American. The Bronx and Brooklyn used to be that way. They've kind of moved to a more Puerto Rican or hipster style people that are living there now. East St. Louis, East Waterloo, having grown up in Northeast Iowa, understanding what East Waterloo means and the importance of your race there, and how many of them feel like they've still got something to prove, feel like the African Americans that are living there are still being treated poorly by the police, being treated poorly by the government. Same sort of things that these African Americans were facing 100 years ago. And then we'll talk about the Harlem Renaissance later in the year, but the Harlem Renaissance is really important. And if you read things like The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, or you've heard of Louis Armstrong, or you know who W.E.B. Du Bois is, and this idea of double consciousness, of understanding that you're African American and you're living in this African American world where you can be as successful as you want to be, but you'll never be as successful as that poor lower class white person that lives down the street from you. That's really hard to understand. When we talk about perspective, that's really, really important to understand why it is that way and why they felt that way. And we'll talk more about that as we get into the 1920s. The last thing that I want to talk about is the connectivity to Iowa. And I mentioned some of these cities before, but you have cities like Davenport, Des Moines, and Waterloo. And so here are the maps. This right here, this map is Waterloo. This map is Davenport. And this map is Des Moines. And so you can tell based on the dots there, green are large chunks of African American population, right? And if you take a look and if you could zoom in, you'll notice railway lines and rivers. Rivers, railway line. River, highways, railway lines. That's where the majority of African Americans settled in Iowa when they came during the Great Migration. They came as strike breakers. They came as agricultural help. They came as factory workers. And what it did was it created white flight amongst the lower level whites. And so those whites who used to live in those areas, they fled to the outside of the city, which later became the suburbs. And it's really interesting because you think about downtowns and the housing around downtowns, those are the oldest parts of cities. They're also oftentimes the poorest parts of cities. And so white flight causes that. The other thing is it creates sides of town or sides of the tracks, right? That idea of he lives on the other side of the tracks. They live on the south side. They live on the east side. Really identified and kind of pigeonholed African Americans to you have to be this stereotype. You can't be your own person. You can't be equal to what everyone else is. And then we still see large numbers of African Americans living in these sections of these towns. And an example might be East Waterloo. East Waterloo's population, the majority of people living in East Waterloo are either lower class white, poor, low socioeconomic status, or low socioeconomic status African Americans. If you take a look at Des Moines, the east side near the fairgrounds, that area, Hoover High School, large numbers of African Americans, and it's been that way since segregation ended in the 1950s. And so it's not just Detroit, it's not just Chicago, it's not just Pittsburgh and some of those places. Iowa has the same connectivity to the Great Migration that these other places had. And it's important to remember that. So the next time you think about why a certain part of a city is the way it is, why the population there looks like it does, acts like it does, has the things go on there that it does, mostly it was influenced by migration or immigration. And in this case, it was influenced highly by African American culture. And it's brought us great things, and it's brought us a lot of important stuff in terms of diversity to Iowa.